So yeah, this is game one from the Chess World Championship, featuring world champion Magnus Carlsen playing with black pieces, and the challenger Fabiano Caruana playing with white. The opening move for this one was e4, pawn to e4, and the response from Carlsen was c5. This is considered like the sort of defense that you would use if you were happy to have like an open game with lots of chances to get a win rather than a draw. This is particularly interesting in this case because it's considered an advantage in chess to have the white pieces. You get the initiative of having the first move, and you get to then sort of begin to guide the shape of the game and the position based on your opening move. So it's considered a slight advantage, and I think for Carlsen to then, he made this response of c5, but there are also other points in the game that suggest that he was going for the win rather than accepting a draw, which is surprising, I would say. This was followed up with knight to f3, and knight to c6, and then bishop to b5. The pawn to c5 reply is known as the Sicilian defense, and this variation with the pawn of the bishop coming out to b5 is known as the Rossolimo variation of that. This was followed by g6, and then the exchange of knight and bishop. The point to be made here, I think, is that having a pair of bishops on the board is always considered a slight advantage. Doubling up somebody's pawns as black's pawns are here now is also considered a bad thing. So, white gets a trade-off. He loses a bishop, but he doubles his opponent's pawns. From there we go for d3, which opens up the path for this dark square bishop to become active and completes the pawn chain with this pawn protecting that one, this one protecting that one. These are just key ideas really in the opening. So bishop g7, which whenever this g6 pawn move is made, normally it's opening up a little hole for this bishop to come in here and potentially cause problems later in the game along this long diagonal. So h3 was played next. Simply, the idea behind this is that the light squared bishop up here can come into this square normally, which then prevents this knight from moving, because if the dark squared bishop is here and the knight moves out the way, the dark squared bishop then captures the queen down here, and the queen is the most powerful piece in either black's army. So to prevent that bishop pinning the knight to the queen, this pawn on h3 comes forward, threatening that square. So now the light square bishop can't come to this square, it will just be captured by the pawn immediately. So h3 is followed by knight to f6, all quite normal, developing knights and bishops and clearing the path for the king to get to safety. Knight c3 was played, followed by knight to d7. The knight move to d7 is a bit unusual. It sort of blocks this bishop in, and it moves the same piece sort of twice in the opening, which is considered slightly bad overall. You should generally be thinking about getting all your pieces developed and getting your king safe pretty much as quickly as possible, but the world champion obviously knows what he's doing and knows exactly when to kind of break those fundamental rules. So bishop e3 was played next, Caruana developing his bishop there, followed by e5, pushing the pawn forward, getting a bit more kind of a foothold on some of these central squares. And then white makes the castling move, which is the only move in chess where you can move two pieces at once, and it's called castling, and it gets your king safe. And that was met with b6, which is an unusual move you don't often see in this kind of situation. It more or less means if black were to sort of castle on this side, which is possible, he wouldn't have pawns sort of tight around his king, creating a defensive structure. He's sort of expanding that a little bit and leaving gaps behind, which sort of suggests he's planning to castle kingside, which seems the more logical choice at this point. So knight h2 came next, which is kind of interesting. I mean, the knight is going to a bad square here. It's not really in the game very much, right on the edge of the board here. But it does also free up the diagonal path for the queen and allows the pawn to be pushed up here to f4, which is a pretty common move in these sort of in these situations. So yes, knight f8 came next, which was a little bit of an unusual move because Carlsen has only just moved this knight over here, and now he's kind of repositioning it back to the f8 square, where it's really looking quite ineffective, but clearly he has plans to just sort of reroute the knight to a more effective square. And then the f4 pawn move was played, which this knight move essentially was preparation for that to take place. And pawn takes, and rook recaptures, so it's a pawn for a pawn. Nothing too surprising there. Let me see. Bishop to e6 is played next, developing this bishop, which is perfectly straightforward. And then the rook comes back to f2, getting itself out of danger and bringing up its diagonal for the bishop. And next we see the move h6. And this was sort of pointed out by the commentators at the time that h6 is a really strange move because, I mean, if the king castles on the queen side, the pawns aren't really providing a tight defensive structure around it. So to now push a pawn over here on the king side means that the same is true if Carlsen chooses to castle over on the king side. So it's essentially weakening his defensive position for his king, no matter which side he ends up castling, which is certainly a bold choice. Queen d2, which just links up the rooks with the king, develops the final piece, really. And then g5, which is a fairly normal continuation from h6. So you now have an advanced pawn here, which is kind of blocking this dark squared bishop in. But again, it's sort of weakening the structures around the king, which is, interesting, and it certainly suggests that Carlsen isn't playing timidly and isn't looking for a draw. So rook f1 creates a lot of strength along the f file. Queen d6, essentially sort of posing threats down this dark diagonal, starting to point pieces towards his king where the corner is. And after queen d6 we have knight g4, which was part of the idea behind moving the knight here. The square that the knight would want to relocate to would always be over on g4. Black then castles on the queen side, which does provide extra strength for the castle and the queen down here, pressure on the d3 pawn and the queen behind it potentially. And so knight f6 came next. Caruana, after the game, actually said that he felt this was a mistake just after he made it. He was less sure about it. And that sort of explains what happens next. Carlsen reroutes his knight, linking up his two rooks, and essentially offering the exchange of knights here. If Caruana wants to capture the knight on d7, the rook will recapture, and then the other rook could come in to d8 to have three pieces, all providing pressure down the d-file. But instead of taking the exchange of knights, Caruana decides to retreat his knight over to the h5 square. I mean, knights in general, you want them in the centre of the board where they can be most effective. So to retreat the knight to h5 seemed quite an ugly position for the knight to be in, and it opened up this dark square diagonal again for the bishop up in the corner. So an interesting move, certainly, and perhaps one that Caruana would regret. And this was then met by bishop e5, adding yet more diagonal pressure down here towards this corner, and things really started looking ominous for the challenger at that point. g4 was then played, essentially an attempt, I think, to nullify this light squared bishop. If Carlsen were to push this pawn forward here to f5, this pawn could recapture, the bishop could recapture. It wouldn't look brilliant for white, but this pawn move adds extra support for this square, and it sort of limits the mobility of the light squared bishop here. f6 was played next, so pushing this pawn forwards just one square. b3 then followed, and I think the main idea behind this is if this knight were to move and this pawn remained on b2, this bishop could just come in and capture it. So in order to be able to move this knight and get it more involved in the game over near the king, he first has to move his pawn to safety, which he does so. And bishop f7 was next. This quite simply threatens the knight over here, which was met with knight to d1. So as planned, this knight now begins to reroute. And knight to f8, Carlsen moves the knight back to this fairly unpleasant looking square, and at the same time basically leaves this pawn undefended, because the white knight could capture, but then the bishop would recapture, the white rook would recapture, and the queen would not be able to recapture because it would be lost to the final rook, which would come in and capture the queen. So that exchange would end up very bad for black. So the only reason behind moving the knight here is to intentionally sacrifice this pawn in order to open up the position more and allow these rooks to get more into the game, which is a brave sacrifice, and yeah, certainly an exciting twist to the match. So Caruana took the pawn, and Carlsen rerouted his knight to e6. This effectively starts to create threats here on the f4 square. This is threatened by a pawn, a bishop, and now the knight as well. So pressure building here. And this was met with knight to h5. The knight essentially just jumps back after capturing the pawn into its position, which wasn't great at the time, but there wasn't really any better square that it could go to. And bishop takes h5. This does give up the bishop pair, but it leaves white with double pawns on the edge of the board, which are hard to defend. It opens a path for this pawn on the g file to start moving forwards, so there's certainly positives in there for black. Knight f4 followed. So now the pressure really begins. Bishop takes, pawn takes, rook moves over to g2. Now the reason this rook moved over to g2 is mostly because this rook can come into the game here and attack the king with check, and then it essentially gives black like a chance to make 2 moves in a row, because anytime your king is put under threat, the only legal move you can make is to get your king out of danger. So to preempt that, the rook moves across to cover the king. Rook g8 comes anyway, and queen e2 follows. Then the rook captures, queen recaptures, and now we have an interesting position, because if this rook were to come across here to g8, it would be pinning the queen to the king. What that means is you're not legally allowed to move your king into danger in check. So this rook over here on g8 will be attacking down this line, which then means that the queen can't move out of the way because it would be moving the king into danger. And it would essentially just mean that the queen would be completely lost if this rook was supported on the g8 square. At the moment it isn't. And the next move has exactly that idea in mind. Queen to e6, which now attacks this g8 square, or supports it rather in this case. And it now means that if the rook were to come here, and the queen were to capture the rook, the queen would recapture. So black would have won the white queen in exchange for a black rook, which the queen is a far more powerful piece than the rook, so that would pretty much just win the game on the spot for black. So knight f2 follow, which you might think doesn't solve the problem, because the rook's just going to come here to g8 and win the queen, and it does indeed come across there. But this knight move is now just in the nick of time to plug the defences here and move into g4. The queen then moves to e8, simply threatening this pawn over on h5. Queen to f3 follows, adding pressure on this pawn here. The queen then takes on h5, and king to f2. The king is now trying to navigate its way out of danger. Bishop goes back to c7, king to e2, and queen to g5. Essentially this is now freeing the path for this pawn to move forward, threatening the knight and forcing it to move, which would then just completely reopen the g-file to these threatening pieces that black has here. So knight goes back to h2, preempting that. h5 does come anyway, and then the rook moves to f2. And this is basically adding another flight square for the knight to move over, where it can add some extra protection to the king. What followed was queen to g1. Now here is where the computers were saying that Carlsen essentially was really gaining the upper hand in the match. He's got complete control over the g-file, he's infiltrated his opponent's camp, and is posing threats against the white king. Knight f1 follows, trying to add some extra protection to the king. h4, and this is where there was actually a moment where Carlsen could have got into a position that was just completely winning. And the computer says that if he brings the rook down to here on g3, well, this knight will capture, and he will have lost a rook, and you can recapture with a pawn, but a rook is worth more than a knight, so it would have been like what we call an exchange sacrifice. It wouldn't have been good in terms of material terms, but it would have created a pawn that was passed and on its way to being converted to a queen if it reaches this back row. That would be supported by this pawn as well, and this queen. So really that would have been a winning moment if he could have found it, but fortunately for Caruana, he didn't. And instead of that, he went king to b2, I believe. White went to king to d2, further fleeing with the king, essentially, to somewhere where there's a bit more protection from pawns. And then black moved king to b7, which is the idea behind that is really that anytime the king is on the back row here, the white queen could come in here and check, which is threatening the king. It could give check, and then it would get an extra free move, essentially. And you never want to sort of give those sort of free moves away, where people can attack your king and then jump to another square. You wouldn't be able to do it right now with the rook there, but at a later time, if the rook wasn't there, the queen could even come up to the back rank here and check, and then attack another piece somewhere else. So that was just simply a case of getting the king somewhere safer. c3 followed, bishop e5, king c2, and queen to g7. And this is the moment where the chance really passed for Carlsen, because whilst he was in this position, he was really tying down these pieces for white, and they're sort of barricading the black queen. But now it alleviates the pressure in many ways. And although there's now two attacking pieces on this c3 pawn, if the bishop takes, the white queen here can just recapture the pawn here on f4, and I mean it's a pawn for a pawn, which isn't really good for black when he's in such a promising positional situation. The knight comes to h2, the bishop does take, queen retakes his pawn here, and the bishop comes to d4, attacking the rook. And at this point, another mistake in retreating the queen all the way back here is that white can now come up here, threaten the king and the queen simultaneously, which forces an exchange of queens. It's not really what black wants at all after such a promising position. And so, queen f7 does happen. Black moves the king out of the way, captures, recaptures, and at this point, really, it's the material's even. Soon after that, there are a couple more rook moves. This rook comes down here to g3 and captures this pawn, which is kind of difficult to defend. And we go into an endgame where the bishop and knight get traded off, and it's rook against rook, and black has one extra pawn. This e-pawn does come up the board and has to be dealt with by black, but in the end the chance has passed, and the game does peter out into a draw. It lasted 114 moves, and I think that was mostly just Carlsen trying to make his challenger sweat and torture him a little bit in the first game. But overall a very interesting match. The world champion probably should have won it, but half a point each, and then they go on to day 2.